Well, many people have worked hard to produce a day like this in Port Royal, and I want to thank them. It's um, a delight, unique in Kentucky. I'll read one of the stories from a new book called Allegiance. I'm proud of the cover. This book comes from Old Cove Press, that press's latest book, and it's great to be on a program with Frank. Old Cove published Frank's first book, Appalachia, about 20 years ago. Okay, this is a short story. It's called Balsam Morning. While I was detoxing in Bluegrass Clinic, my buddies Lee and Dexter and Paul and Rusty had gone on with their rowdy behavior as far as weekend drinking was concerned. We had all known for years that eventually we'd have to give up our weekend parties. It wasn't that we were intelligent and at least moderately educated drinkers. 20 years ago, Lee had gone to law school for 2 years before dropping out to help his father operate a radio station. I'm 2/3 of a lawyer, he told people. After 7 years in the Air Force, Paul had become a paramedic and owner of an ambulance service in Findlay County. Before his divorce and resulting obligation to pay his ex-wife serious alimony payments, Rusty had his own construction company. At one time, Rusty had employed Dexter as a drywall hanger. After the divorce, they were both unemployed for several years. I was the editor of the local newspaper and the oldest one in the group at 53. When I came home from Bluegrass Clinic after 2 weeks of proper diet, daily exercise, and guided introspection, looking younger and healthier than any of my buddies, it was instantly agreed that the time had come to give up all bad habits in preparation for the later stages of life. I said I'd be glad to go camping, but that I didn't plan on doing any drinking. They thought they'd try staying sober for a weekend themselves. Clearly, the moment had arrived for us to actually do a thing we had talked about for years but had never managed. It was time for us to graduate from our adolescent behavior and quit drinking. But of course, such momentous changes could not be brought about without certain solemn rituals and ceremonies. We decided to lay out on Balsam Ridge all night one more time. The Friday night before our trip, we partied pretty hard at Lee and Barbara's, and so it went without saying that we weren't exactly efficient and well-organized outdoorsmen on Saturday morning. It was like wading through molasses trying to get ready to go camping. It took us all morning to load the quilts and tarps and coats and sweaters and skillet and coffee pot and jugs of water and a big ice chest full of beer and various other camping paraphernalia into Dexter's Buick station wagon. Barbara was amused by us would-be outdoorsmen, but about noon she took pity on us and fixed us a sausage and eggs and gravy and biscuits breakfast. It was 2 p.m. before we were ready to go. When we were all in the car with the motor running, Barbara came over and leaned through the window to give Lee a goodbye kiss. Then, addressing the rest of us, she said, "It ain't like I want you all out of the house or nothing." "We know that, Barbara," several of us said together. "I mean, I really have no desire to just be quiet at home and watch TV and read magazines all weekend." "But you're willing to sacrifice for us," said Dexter, behind the steering wheel. "I really would like to hear all the interesting things you say when you're drunk, especially since I haven't heard it since last night." "This is our last party," Lee said sheepishly. "We're going to be different men when we come back." "I know you are," said Barbara. "Wilgus, you make sure Lee comes back a different person, okay?" "I'll do it," I said. "It's at the very top of my agenda." The breakfast gave us enough strength to drive to the county line to get a fresh load of booze. We got to the liquor store and made our purchases easily enough, but at the last minute, Paul decided he had to run next door to the one-stop market to get some bread and bologna and honey buns to eat during the night, which made Dexter think of all the stuff he thought he ought to go buy too. When we were all loaded in the car again, ready to take off, Dexter decided he had to run back in the one-stop and get some aspirins and a bottle of NyQuil to taper off on later that night. Then he wound up opening the bottle and spilling about 1,000 aspirins on the floor before he'd even paid for them. Lee and me went in to help him pick his aspirins up, during which time a blonde woman that Rusty seemed to know pulled up to the gas pumps, and he got into a private talk with her that took about 20 minutes to finish. As we all managed to get settled in the car again, my Uncle Delmer walked up saying if he didn't get to the flea market over at Champion in half an hour, his ex-wife Pauline wouldn't let him use her T-shirt booth to sell the doodads he had made during his recent time in the Veterans Hospital. I love Delmer. But this was too much for me. I leaned across Dexter, who was in the driver's seat, and stuck my head out the window and told Delmer that we were trying to get to Balsam Ridge before dark, and we didn't have time to take him to no Champion. "Oh, hell, Wilgus," Paul yelled from the back seat. "We can give Delmer a ride." "Why, yes," said Lee. "Climb in here, Delmer." What this meant was 12 more miles in the wrong direction, in addition to the 15 miles out of the way we'd already driven to get our liquor. I had to sit in the middle of the front seat so Delmer could have room for the sack of goods he was carrying. "Delmer, you're not in the best of company, I reckon you know," said Paul. "I know," said Delmer. "I know you boys and your daddies too." He grinned at me. "I especially know this one here." "How you doing today, Delmer?" I asked him. I didn't want us to drive Delmer anywhere, but I was glad to see him. Delmer had been one of my great friends all my life. He was the best guy in the world when he wasn't crazy or drunk or otherwise flew off in his mind. "I'm doing very well," Delmer said, "long as I get these goods over to Pauline. I'm sorry to interrupt you boys' trip." "It don't matter," said Dexter. "We're on our way to Balsam to get drunk. Why don't you come lay out with us?" Delmer looked around the car. He had about a 4-day beard, and his old clothes had their usual mildew smell. In his early life, Delmer had been a dashing figure when he wasn't being a derelict. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped being either dashing or a derelict and had learned to just be Delmer, an old man with peculiar ways that the local community made a place for. Today, he looked bright-eyed and happy. 15 years ago next April, I'd have been right with you boys, Delmer said. It's good to see somebody sober, Delmer, said Lee. What have you got in your sack? One thing and another, said Delmer. He opened his burlap sack and started taking things out and passing them around. He had stomach ulcers that put him in the VA hospital once or twice a year. He always came home with things he had made in the craft shop. He usually made wallets and wristbands and stuff out of leather, but this time he had whittled a bunch of crosses out of cedar, all about the size of your hand. There was one he had made out of black walnut that he had shined to a high finish. He had made several butterflies, too. By winding gold thread around nails he had driven into boards in the shape of a butterfly. Why, Delmer, these things are beautiful, I said. How much are you going to sell these for? I need $6 apiece for my butterflies, he said. My crosses is $3 apiece, except that one there. He pointed to the shiny black walnut cross. That one's for Pauline. She started back to church here lately. I thought she might like something like that. If I had $6, I'd buy this butterfly myself, said Paul. Me and my wife's been on the outs here lately. This butterfly might sweeten her up a little. What he means, Delmer, is that Rosette kicked him out for being a drug addict, said Willis. Well, she'd like this butterfly, said Delmer. You can pay me later if you want to. That's a deal, said Paul, and he reached across the car to shake Delmer's hand. By the time we got to Champion, we had all bought crosses from Delmer on credit. And Paul and Lee had bought a butterfly piece. We'd run through several more beers by the time we let Delmer out. You boys be careful, he said. We'll pay you your money, Delmer, don't you worry, Paul yelled to him out the window. I ain't worried, Delmer called back. Everything's in the Lord's hands. Tell Pauline I'll see her this weekend, I yelled. I'll tell her, Delmer called back. You boys come to Trace Fork Sunday. You'd all be welcome. Let's all get out and go to the flea market, Paul said. But Dexter was already steering the car back onto the highway, headed back toward Whitaker and Route 15. An hour later, we were at the mouth of Bonnet Creek on the far side of the county, starting up Balsam Ridge. Thank you.